Leading the post-war boom was an artist whose outstanding work would give a major impetus to redefining architectural stained glass.
Georg Meistermann was forbidden by the Nazis to paint. He was actually, when he wanted to paint, he was in a monastery and he was hiding away for years and years.
His work was condemned by the Nazi regime, and his studio and all his early works were burned. And he was recruited into the army, but he was a conscientious objector, so he spent the war peeling potatoes.
The Nazis labeled modern artists as degenerates, derided them in an exhibition, and banned them and their work altogether. This, of course, included Meistermann. A self-portrait secretly painted during the war shows Meistermann in a confusing limbo. His eyes are empty and his frustration with confinement is evident. He's holding a plumb bob as if to try to gain some equilibrium. Meistermann was a strongly opinionated man, especially when it came to the Nazis and the Catholic Church. He was incensed by what the Nazis had done to Germany and to Europe, and felt that the Catholic Church should have shown more opposition to them at the time. Meistermann had a fondness for the town of Wittlich in the Mosel wine-growing area, and his first major post-war commission was to design a complete set of windows for the St. Marcus Church in the center of town. He began with the choir windows. On the left he featured Mary with a young Jesus, and on the other side Mary with the 12 disciples. He also took the form of the ceiling and inverted it, and turned it into a repeated motif for the extreme left and right windows. Meistermann gave Mary a black face to show that she was not a white, blue-eyed Aryan. Black Madonnas are not uncommon, but the church refused to pay Meistermann until he gave Mary a pale face. He reluctantly changed out the glass, but, after he was paid in full, he slipped back into the church and darkened her face again.
Meistermann was not a man who actually was much in favor of the Catholic Church. He was a Christian, but not necessarily organized religion.
He had a lot of cynicism in almost all forms of government and religious organizations.
The central choir window shows the resurrection of Jesus, notable for his robe which appears to be fluttering in the breeze. It's the first sign that Meistermann was interested in depicting movement in his windows. It was not a new concept. There are many traditional windows that show movement or stopped action. But what Meistermann was about to do with movement in the coming 10 years was unprecedented. And this was just the first glimpse of it.
One of the first buildings that was built was the new radio station in Cologne, new contemporary building, which had a gigantic staircase in the center of it, and he was asked to design these glass walls. When you go there, like I've seen it, 30 years later or so, then you realize the amazing vitality of this work and the joyfulness and this breath of fresh air. You can see that he was filled with hope, and that's how it was perceived by all the other artists who actually went to see it later on.
And again, a lot of people at that time thought he's totally crazy to do that.
Meistermann wanted to abstractly depict the energy of music and the power of radio transmission, and, every so often, there is an almost recognizable object such as a stringed instrument or a transmitting device. The windows are alive with movement. They are almost chaotic. It is the lines, rather than the colors, that provide the energy. The old Wittlich Town Hall has been turned into a museum, housing works by Meistermann and hosting exhibitions by guest artists. These two Meistermann windows show him further exploring the power of rhythm and repetition. The museum is mostly known for being the home of his 4 powerful anti-war windows.
The 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse are created by Meistermann in 1954. The first is the Victory Man, who starts with the apocalyptic time, and for Meistermann this first horseman was as well the horseman who has started with the apocalyptic Nazi regime in Germany. All these leaders who enter into a city who are the winner of the war, they will bring somehow peace and somehow death. It can be as well a new Nero, a new Stalin, a new Hitler, a new dictator who is taking over power of a city or of an area. And the second horseman represents the horseman of the war and the civil war, that everyone will kill each other. And if some people have survived, they will be killed by the third horseman, by the horseman who is responsible for hunger. And if after the third horseman some people will live, they will be killed definitely, and all of them, by the fourth horseman of the death. The fourth window is showing the scene of Wittlich, when Wittlich was bombed by the Allies in December of 1944. Meistermann wanted to show with this window that the war has been caused by Adolf Hitler and the majority of the Germans who have voted for Adolf Hitler.
In the 1950s, architect Rudolf Schwarz designed a church where the ground plan is in the shape of a parabola, whose arms widen out to infinity. Schwarz's original blueprint had a radiating circular design in that window, but Meistermann convinced him that there is another form that, like a parabola, also reaches out to infinity.
Meistermann decided to work with the spiral form to show, like the concept of the Bible, of Alpha and Omega, that everything comes from the earth and the cosmos to God, and from God coming all the things to the cosmos. Meistermann used the three primary colors, blue, red and yellow, as a symbol: blue for God the Father, red for His Son, and yellow for the Holy Spirit and His influence to every spiritual things.
I had seen it in publications. It never occurred to me how big this was. The first time I saw it, I was overwhelmed. It was gigantic.
It was really revolutionary at the time, because Meistermann precedes most of the other designers by half a generation. He was much older.
He was a Christian, so he believed in all these stories, and he believed in the teachings of them, and also how he could interpret it and sort of pass it on to others.
There's a lot going on in any one of his compositions, and it's not something that you can just look at and dismiss. I mean, if you're an artist, you just keep getting drawn in more and more and more. The windows at St. Florian were very unusual in that they all had a very painterly quality as opposed to architectural quality to them.
Here he comes in and does one kind of window here, one kind of window there, another thing here, very provocatively.
The backgrounds are very dark, very, very dense. Some very, very rich colors, especially some of his purples and his deep reds. And then the figures are almost in, whites and clears, which emphasize the linear quality. Meistermann's use of painting is really beautiful. It's very lyrical. It's very minimalist. There's not a stroke that is unnecessary.
The Impressionists were interested in juxtaposing many colors together to make one color. Meistermann was interested in doing that in glass. Many of those little pieces, they make his windows scintillate.
The Pietà window is just a marvelous color composition. When you look at it, it's got that very, very dark top and then those very soft colors down below.
He's almost intentionally blocking out the light.
I think he thought of his windows as drawings first, whereas if you look back in history, everyone has been basically trying to hide the lead line. What was behind the lead line or between the lead line was the important part of the window. But in Meistermann's work, there were lines that came in, and they may have represented something, but there was graphic stuff going on there, graphics meaning drawing. Meistermann seemed like a big giant in the background. You know, they owed him so much. because the jump between Thorn-Pricker and him was large.
The sense of movement in these two windows makes them especially dramatic. The Gabriel window has a triangular composition to the lines of movement, and the repetition of the lines adds to the strength of the movement.
These double lines, triple lines, 4 lines next to each other, which are almost like the shadow of a shadow of a shadow, and you don't exactly know what you're looking at, and all of a sudden it creates this depth. He was really, really ahead of his time. Luckily, we had him, and it always needs sort of people who dare to do something entirely different. He influenced a lot of people.
Meistermann was very aware of transparency and translucency in nature, and was particularly interested in leaves and the light that shines through them. Each one is different, like fingerprints, and to him, the leaf became a symbol of uniqueness of the individual.
Once I visited the crypta of St. Vitus in Mönchengladbach with my grandfather, and he jumped around like a little child. He was very convinced about his work because he said it's free and independent work, it's pure artwork. He was so happy that his work was a combination of drawings and painting works, and he was totally convinced that he has developed an absolutely free and independent style. He has chosen and selected, in the end, all the colors of a rainbow. In Sangerion, Meistermann fulfilled, as he said, his most important life work and as well his testament for his religious convictions. Münster is one of the last works of Meistermann. He said, well, this is a result of a man who has become very old and will realize that life deals all the time with death. And as you can see in my windows, I've chosen dark colors to show the influence of death, and of course bright colors and colorful colors to show power and the capacity of the love of God to fulfill us.
Meistermann had a studio in a village in the Eifel region, and he would often gaze out at the birds, watching them landing and taking off, and he envied their ability to fly. He was fascinated by the buzzards, in particular, and how when the wind was just right, they could hover in one place, hardly moving. He found a spiritual metaphor in this act of hovering or levitation. The symbol indicates that not only is something in the air, but also in transition. Over 22 years, he used variations of the symbol in paintings and stained glass, and it even appears on the Meistermann family grave.
The picture of Daniel and the lions is a very typical picture for Meistermann. This picture shows purely his own conception of life, that if you have a conviction, you must be able to live, fight, or die for it.
After the war, he became a very famous German artist because he was a ferocious fighter for the freedom of expression and artistic freedom.
Meistermann was convinced that you have to decide as an artist and as well as a political person. And somehow it's a biographical picture of his own life. In the face, in the head of Daniel, you can recognize as well the typical forms which belongs to Meistermann, And this is another hint how Meistermann liked to play with autobiographical hints and links just to show other people, in the end, I'm telling about myself.